In parts 1 and 2, we examined the observer pattern. We looked at the basics of how it operated, and then we looked at implementing it using the sort of classic method of implementing it, using interfaces. In part 3, we're going to look at how to implement it using the C# mechanism, and we're going to find out, hopefully, that it's actually a little bit easier to do, certainly a lot cleaner. Right, so first of all, with C#, using delegates, and delegates are function pointers, as we'll discuss a little bit more further, we don't actually use interfaces. Now, in the past, what we've been doing when we've been passing variables around is we've been passing either references to values or objects. With delegates, we can actually pass references to functions or references to methods on an object. So we can get around the need to have an interface because we can tell it exactly which method we want to execute. We don't have to rely on an interface to provide a common method. We can actually tell a variable exactly which method it should execute when somebody tries to utilize that. So first and foremost, let's get rid of our interface. We're not going to need that anymore. If I come down to iNew news item, I can delete it, and it's gone. Okay, we can also clean up newsfeed quite a bit. So let's take a look at newsfeed and figure out what needs to stay and what needs to go. Everything to do with stories definitely needs to stick around. We're not getting rid of that. But we are going to get rid of this interface, and we're going to get rid of the list of interfaces. Okay, we're going to have a different way of dealing with listeners. Okay, we're going to have a list, essentially a list of delegates. Okay. So we got rid of that. We also no longer need to loop through our listeners. So let's get rid of that. But the concept still remains. We still need to notify listeners. That's not going anywhere. This notion of register listeners stays, but we're going to do it in a different way. So I'm going to get rid of this method and move on. So back to our class diagram. The interfaces that these classes implement now can be removed. So let's go ahead and take care of those. They're still forms, but they no longer need to implement the iNewNewsItem interface. Save that. Go back to the new list, news list form. Remove that as well. In both cases, we can remove our need to register with the listener, but again, the concept needs to stay the same. We still need to register as a listener. We're just going to do it in a slightly different way. Okay, so now back to the newsfeed. Now we're going to be dealing with a variable. Okay, it's a variable of type delegate, and the delegate itself is going to hold a reference to a method. When we want to notify our listeners of a new news story, we're going to call the method, or in this case it will be methods, that have been stored in that variable, in that delegate variable. Now in order to do that, we first got to declare a type of variable. Okay, in this case it's a type of variable that is different than what we're used to. Normally what we deal with when we're dealing with variables are ints or object types. At this point we're going to declare a new type of variable. Okay, and it's going to be a type of variable called a delegate. And when we declare a delegate, we declare the way the method is called, okay, the method's signature. In this particular case, it's going to be a void method. It's not going to return anything. And we call the method, we're going to have to pass in a news story. Now, when we're dealing with the delegate, we also have to give it a name, and that goes where the name of the method normally would. Now, this becomes the name of the delegate type. Okay, so this is going to be a new news story delegate. We could call it whatever we want, but we're going to call the name of our variable type new news story delegate. Okay, so we're going to be able to declare variables of type new news story delegate. And those variables will hold pointers to methods that look like this. Okay, they return nothing, they return void, and as a parameter, they take a new news story. When somebody wants to register their interest in receiving new news stories, they will put a reference to a method that handles that eventuality, that event, into a variable. And we're going to declare here a place to put that. So we're going to declare a public new news story delegate. Remember, it's a data type, listeners. Okay, so that's a variable that can hold the reference to, or a reference to, a method. That method will be called whenever anybody wants to hear about a news story. Okay, so the idea here is that we want to call that method. And we pass in the variable to that method. In this case, it's the new news story that we care about receiving information on. So listeners here is holding a reference to a method. We're calling that method and passing in the story. Now, in order for us to actually know what method to call, the interested parties, the listeners, the listening forms in this case, will need to add a method to that listener variable. They'll need to pass in a method or set that listener variable to a method that matches this signature. Now, if we run over here, we used to have one that was a common method. This, I didn't delete it from here, but this receive news story was a common method. But it actually turns out we already had a common method that took the same kind of parameters, returned a void, so we really didn't need to create this redundant method. What we really need to do, though, is just tell our news feed to run this method whenever it finds a new news story, whenever it receives a new news story. That's the way we're going to register ourselves as a listener. So here I'm going to say feed. Okay, we've got a news feed that has a listener's variable. Okay, it's a public field on that object, and we're going to set it to a method. Add news story, and we don't have to pass any parameters or anything here. We're just saying that this is the method that needs to be called whenever I receive, or whenever I want to receive, a new news story. Okay, so we're setting it to a method. It's a little bit different. We're not setting it to a value or to a reference to an object. We're setting it as basically a reference to a method. Need to do the same thing over here. We've got our feed passed in as a variable. Feed.listeners equals receive news story. Just happens to be the same method name over here as it was in the other one. Okay, so again, when the news feed has a story added to it, it adds a story to its list of stories, and it calls whatever method is assigned to this listener's delegate. So let's see what results we've got. We're going to actually find that there's a bit of a problem here. Okay, one of the problems is that I'm missing a semicolon. So let's fix that. When we declare a delegate, we have to fix that. And we run it. Let's see what we get. Okay, so in my feed master, I'm going to open up a ticker, and I'm going to open up a list, and I'm going to add a new news story. I post it, and you can see it went down here, but it didn't go up here. Okay, and what we're seeing is that when we declared that this listener should be assigned to a new news story, we did it with an equal sign. And so when I opened up my ticker form to start with, it assigned this function to it. And then when I opened up my news list form, I added it again. So I've got a different add news story. So it's only executing the last one that I assigned to it. Now, because we used a void return, we actually have the option to use what's called a multicast delegate, which basically means that if I've got a delegate variable type, I can add multiple methods to that. And the way that I do that is to use the plus equals operator. Okay? So I come over here and I say that it's not just this method, but it's whatever methods are currently assigned to it plus this method. So now over here when I execute listener's story, it's actually going to call all of the methods that have been added to this listener. So the plus equals operator allowed me to add multiple methods. Now again, that only works if my delegate type returns a void. If it doesn't return a void, I can only assign a single method to that variable. But at this point, I should be able to add a new story and have it show up in any and all listeners that I open up. Okay, so we see that the news story showed up in both the ticker and in the news list. Now we here talk about the concept of an event, and it turns out that an event is really a specialized form of a delegate. And what an event does is it forces you to use multicasting. So again, if I've declared a void here, declared a void return as my delegate type, I can use multicasting. If I put an event in front of my delegate type, I've now forced it to use the plus equals operator. I can no longer assign a single value to it. If I change this to an equals, you see I've got an error that comes up that says the event must be assigned using the plus equals operator. So it's essentially a means of forcing you to support multicasting. And that is the core behind the event model for components. So when we're dealing with buttons or list boxes or anything else that we can assign multiple event handlers to, behind the scenes, C# is actually leveraging delegates and event declarations. So there's no way we can assign only a single equals to an event. We actually have to leverage that. So that's really the magic behind events. It's just forcing us to use the multicast delegate option. Okay, so that's the last of our three-part series on the observer pattern. Hopefully you'll be able to leverage some of this in future applications. It's a very useful pattern to use, and it's very easy to leverage within C#.